Okay, so our plenary lecture to take us up to the coffee break is Professor John Downing from the University of Iowa. So please come up, John. John had plenty of exposure and publicity in the first day of the conference. I think that's enough glory for one person for one lifetime. So I'll just welcome John now. Welcome. Maybe take questions.
Can I? Yes, please. Very good. Let's see if this, yeah, good, great, it works, so I don't have to stand all in one place, but that's great. It is a great pleasure to address this august body of limnologists responsible for ensuring the quality and sustainability of the world's most important strategic resource. It's a great responsibility we have, all of us together who work in the aquatic sciences. Today, I am addressing you as the president of the Association for the Sciences of Limnology and Oceanography, and I am bringing greetings from its board of directors. This plenary address was conceived over Japanese beer, I believe, in Biwa, where we thought that it would be a great idea for us to work together more, and by giving this plenary address and collaborating in our meetings, it's designed to express a spirit of future cooperation between SIL and ASLO as we all struggle together to ensure the world's stewardship of fresh and salty water across the planet, which is a great and growing responsibility, I think. So I am trying to speak as president of ASLO, but I always break character, so I'm sure I'll just turn into myself in a minute, but anyway. So the topic today is kind of a strange title, for which I've already been criticized in the elevator a couple of times. Basically saying Limnology and Oceanography, they are two estranged twins that are being reunited by global change. Now, I would apologize first because plenaries are usually meant to be scientific and synthetic, and I would be so much more comfortable giving a talk like that. But this one is meant to be reflective and forward-looking and thinking about water resources on the planet and how we all can work together to do a better job of building theory and being good stewards of these resources. So here's my plan and overview. The purpose is really to encourage limnologists to be proud of our role in assisting oceanography and show that the two fields are coming back together via global change. Oceanographers' ecosystems are beginning to suffer, I think, the same insults that limnologists have been dealing with for decades, if not centuries. So my plan is there, first to talk about the strategic importance of our water mission, next talk about the twins, their parallel development. I call them the twins. I really do think they're very similar in so many ways. In fact, for full disclosure, I should say that I was raised in freshwater ecosystems. I spent most of my life as a kid underwater, and but then thought I needed to study, in order to study those aquatic resources, I had to go to a marine institute for a master's degree. I started at Rosenstiel to do a master's degree, but then realized that what I really wanted to do was to apply the same sorts of theories derived in marine systems to freshwater systems. And in fact, what I didn't realize at the time was that those theories, many of them, those thoughts on zonation and so on, had actually been stimulated by limnological research. So I basically came back full circle and then built my career in limnology. Although I, like many other limnologists, have no self-control concerning salinity and tend to write papers on saline waters if I feel like it. Anyway, the twin fields. And then I thought I'd reveal for the first time in public the top 10 problems and paradigms in limnology, and I'll try and justify how those were derived, and then talk about the convergence of problems. Actually, I'll also talk about the top 10 problems in oceanography and compare them, and then talk about the convergence of problems through global change. And then I will try to justify my very bold contention that the seas really aren't different from lakes. They're just big salty ones. And I'll try and build that idea and then talk about exchanges between limnology and oceanography and a little bit on the future of the aquatic sciences. So that's my plan. So ASLO, for those of you who don't know what it is, it's called the Association for the Sciences of Limnology and Oceanography. It was started in the 1930s, actually, as the American Society of Limnology. It added, or sort of co-opted, the Pacific Society of Oceanography in the 1940s, and then became the American Society of Limnology and Oceanography. The association changed its name in about 2011 because all of a sudden we realized that we were only 52% North American, and so we are made up of about 4,500 members, about 45% limnologists, and 28% of the limnologists do both limnology and oceanography, which I find intriguing. Interestingly, only about 12% of oceanographers also dabble in the best waters of the world in the inland areas. We have 3 journals and a bulletin. We have an e-lectures program and e-books. And we have about 1.5 meetings annually on average, and a third of the meetings are pretty much only limnology. It's just for those of you who really don't know what ASLO is. That's what it is. I think limnologists have an important mission. Inland water is the most strategic resource now and in the future, and in the past, actually. It's essential to life and all that sustains the quality of the human condition on the planet, and increasing population is going to put unprecedented pressure on water supplies, as I'm sure all of you are aware. This is a big bar graph taken from the OECD showing the gross freshwater abstractions. These are the percentages of the overall total renewable resources abstracted or taken out each year by various countries around the world. I'd like you to think about, however, what this means when we consider that the average rate of renewal of inland waters is only about 7%, because the average water residence time for inland waters is about 17 years, according to Professor Kalf and many others. So 7% is down in here, and many places around the world are abstracting large quantities of water above and beyond what the actual renewal rate is already, and this situation is likely to become even more serious over time. And these abstraction rates, of course, don't include what we as limnologists know to be the true spoiling of water. It's not withdrawing it, it's polluting it and destroying it for any other particular use. So, limnology and oceanography cover the life of water along the hydrologic cycle. Here's the hydrologic cycle. Here are our lakes and inland waters and streams. Some of the water gets shunted through groundwater, but as it moves from the ocean into the atmosphere, down onto the land surface, it's held for some period of time, and this is what we work on. But the limnology and oceanography together deal with this part and this part too. The world's water is where ASLO members work, and basically covering most of it. About 97% of the world is covered with oceans, and continental waters only include about 3% of the world's overall water. If you break out that continental water into another pie chart, the liquid water on the continents is only 30% of that 3%, and about 70% of that water is frozen, actually declining over time, of course, as we know now. If you then break out that part of the liquid water into its other components, we find that only about 3% of that overall liquid continental water is in fact usable surface water, and about half of that would be in fact saline. So a very, very small fraction of the water in the world. Lots of it is studied by oceanographers. We study a tiny fraction, but an extremely important fraction as limnologists. Now, if you want to put this in some kind of context you can actually deal with, you can look at a football stadium. I'm not particularly for Chelsea, by the way. It's the only image I could find. But if you visualize the world's total water as the size of a football field, then in fact the water that we work on is 1 centimeter of that football field, an extremely tiny fraction, but that is the fraction that is actually usable on a daily basis, rapidly renewed, clean, and functional for industry and domestic supply. A very important mission, that 1 centimeter of the football field. Now, I'd like to talk about the twins, who I call the twins. We share a lot of history, we share many paradigms, and I believe that we share a common future converging. Now, you may say to me that you think that the twins of oceanography and the limnology look different. This often is true. Twins sometimes seem to be extremely different. On the other hand, things that are different to start with, if that's where you believe limnology and oceanography are, sometimes dissimilar things tend to converge. If you haven't seen this website about people who look like their pets, you really should look at it. It's one of my very favorites. These are some of the characteristics of inland waters and oceans, just to put you in context for the difference between the twins. Obviously, there are differences between them. For example, inland waters are only about 3% of the world's water area, for example, and oceans about 97% of the area. But if you think about the fraction of the world's usable water on a daily basis for domestic use and industrial use, inland waters are about 99% of that, whereas marine waters are only about 1%. The water residence time of inland waters is about 17 years, whereas the water residence time of the seas and oceans is about 2,500 years. From Jaap Kalf's Limnology book, I've seen estimates as high as 4,000 years for water residence time of the sea. Interestingly to me, the likely biodiversity of inland waters is pretty close to marine systems, although we really don't know much about biodiversity, which I think is a great failing in limnology, that we have not paid close attention to genetic and phylogenetic variants. But probably, usually when parallel studies are done, for marine systems tend to have about 4 times more species once the detailed taxonomy is actually done than freshwaters do. The thought now is that marine systems probably have about 1 million species, and that would suggest that freshwaters, once we get done figuring it all out, will have about 250,000 different species. A very high rate of biodiversity, especially when you consider that they are 30 times smaller than the marine systems. The percent of the species described is small, and about 1/4 for marine systems. And if you look at the water that's relevant to human beings, the fraction of the world population that lives within 100 kilometers of inland waters is probably close to 100%, whereas it's something like 33% for marine systems. And if you consider the people who live within the tidal area of the world, it's only about 10% of the world population. And here's one that I'm really interested in too. People say that 50 to 85% of the oxygen we breathe comes from the sea, which doesn't really fit with the numbers that I've seen for net heterotrophy or autotrophy of marine systems. So my guess is that question mark there should be replaced with a larger number than marine systems for inland waters, if you consider their overall autotrophy. And world fish landings, about 10% in growing for inland waters and 90% in declining for marine systems. So they are different. Our twins are different. So I'd like to go through a bit of the history of limnology and oceanography and convince you that they have similar foundations, although the historical stimulus for doing these studies was somewhat different. Both freshwater and marine systems had military, studying them had military importance because freshwater systems have been used for thousands of years to put populations under siege. And I'll show you a few examples of that. Whereas in oceanography, the studies early studies tried to figure out how to get military vessels various places so that they could take over trade and so on. So a little bit different military foundation. Freshwaters, the foundations were domestic water supply because of the importance of algae blooms, taste, odor, and illness. Flooding and drought were stimuli for development of limnology, as well as health, aesthetics, recreation, and of course fish production. Oceanography was basically driven by need to navigate and transport, and also for travel and shipping, fisheries, resources, and also exploitation of marine mammals. I won't do a whole dry history of limnology and oceanography as it's early in the day, and I might lose you. But freshwater, inland water has been a source of conflict since about 3000 BC, at least in any recorded history. It's been used as a military tool, a military target. It's been used for acts of terrorism long before we knew what terrorism was defined as, in development disputes among groups of people. And there's a wonderful account of all this by Peter Gleich, who lists many pages of these conflicts where freshwater has been used militarily over the last 3,000 years in his The World's Water 2008-2009 volume. But here are a few of them. In 2500 BC, Urlama, king of Lagash, diverted water to boundary canals, drying up water supplies for Umma. 720 BC, Sargon II of Assyria destroyed the Armenian irrigation system and network and flooded their land. Leonardo da Vinci and Machiavelli also had a plan to totally divert the Arno River from Pisa so that Florence could triumph over Pisa. The British, the Chinese, and many others have engaged in a variety of acts having to do with water. Very colorful, interesting, and charming approaches to the destruction of water resources. I'll give you a quick timeline and basically cut to the chase on the history. But oceanography traces its history unfairly, I think, back about to 4000 BC, which may be somewhat of an exaggeration. If we consider navigation as oceanography, then possibly that's true. But if we're going to consider navigation as oceanography, then I think we need to consider the first time people drank water as limnology. And so we can go back even farther than 4000 BC. But in any case, in the 1600s, some limnological studies and oceanographic studies began. Boyle's work on chemistry of water started at about the same time that Varenius was trying to type lakes. Starting in the early 1800s, people began to look at stratification and structure and water chemistry, and also began to identify plankton and benthos with both in parallel in oceanography and in limnology. The Great Lakes were considered to be overfished by 1871, and so a lot of limnology was being done to figure out those questions. The government marine labs all over the world marine research institutes were starting in about 1870 because of need to ensure fish food supplies. Oceanographic cruises started in the 1880s, and at the same time, thermoclines were being discovered discovered and described by Burge, Judet, and Richter all over the world. And as early in 1900, the great Forel trilogy on Le Léman was published, and also books in oceanography. Very similar foundations in those two important aquatic fields. There have been lots of historical exchanges between limnology and oceanography, and I think that many of them have been the transfer of limnological principles to oceanographic systems. And I put these just in alphabetical order so that you can kind of see see them and look up your favorite name. But Epstein, for example, inspired Brandt, the very famous oceanographer, in his plankton work with the analyses of plankton in lakes around Schleswig-Holstein. Burgeon Judet inspired Atkins' Plymouth studies, analyses of marine stratification, and became the foundation of Brandt's early analyses of plankton production. Tommy Edmondson, a longtime member of ASLO, did his first nutrient manipulation experiments on marine waters at Woods Hole. Fry, who was a translator of our dear book Rutner, which was my first limnology text that I used, was instrumental in Atkins' thermal analyses of the sea because he was experimenting in reservoirs with small things that were sort of the precursor to thermistors. Harvey did work on seawater chemistry that created lake trophic classification of today, so helped transfer back into limnology. Hogben, a marine scientist, was the person who inspired Hutchinson to begin working on limnological systems. And Hutchinson, of course, was a foundation and inspiration and mentor to Riley, a great oceanographer, and was a foundation of modeling and trophodynamics of marine systems. Charles Kofoid, again, worked on plankton size distributions and fine-tuned the methods that later were used in marine studies. Redfield, of course, an important oceanographer. All of us know about Redfield ratios, I think, and so that's a transfer of oceanographic information back to limnology. Gordon Riley was a limnologist who was trained by Hutchinson, who became, in later times, one of the all-time great biological oceanographers and a foundation of that field. And I think we all know about Secchi, who was an oceanographer who built the Secchi disk for looking at water clarity, and which has become iconic for the study of limnology. Victor Shelford examined the light distribution work in marine freshwaters, which was important to marine productivity research. And Warden Whipple, worked for the New York Water Works and was involved in taste and odor problems in waterworks reservoirs. And that's why the Warden Whipple book became the foundation really of what we do in phytoplankton research often, because they were identifying different types of organisms, and especially those involved in formation of blooms, which then became inspired Brandt's work on plankton, and especially marine plankton blooms and dynamics. So the exchanges have been great, and many of our famous limnologists have inspired oceanography over the history of that field. So now I would like to talk about top 10, because I'd like to show you what I believe are the top problems in limnology, and not so much that I believe that, but that others that I have consulted believe are the top problems, and then contrast them with what oceanographers do. Limnology and oceanography have shared a lot of history, but I wanted to know how similar we are today. So I did email interviews of several very good limnologists and oceanographers, and basically did a vote counting approach. And I asked them, tell me, don't think about it, but just tell me what the 3 to 5 top problems are now in your field. What are the 3 to 5, what do you expect to be the 3 to 5 top problems in 10 years? And because healthy sciences need a few major growing paradigms, I also asked them to tell me what the top 3 to 5 research paradigms are now and maybe in the future. So I will now show you my top 10 list, given some good fortune. I tried to get PowerPoint to do these backwards like they do on talk shows and stuff, but I can't do that. For some reason, it doesn't allow that amount of drama. But according to the experts that I've consulted, many of the most helpful are listed in that list there. The number one problem in limnology today is eutrophication and other water pollution. Number 2, aquatic invasive species. Number 3, the effects of altered hydrology. Number 4, habitat destruction. Number 5, climate change and its effects on water quantity and quality. Number 6, novel chemicals, toxins, xenobiotics, drugs. and their effects on freshwater or inland water systems. Lost biodiversity and endangered species. Number 8, water quantity, demand, and management. Number 9, overexploitation and overuse. And number 10, agricultural impact. I was really glad to see that one show up because I do a lot of that. A whole bunch of other problems showed up in the list, but these are just the top 10. I was happy to see that Kathy, I think, cited almost all of these. I'm not sure she missed any of them. Maybe water, well, not even water quantity and demand. Hit them all. So you can now figure out what your next Nature paper will be on. You just combine all these in some novel way with some data and a pretty graph, and you've got them made. Now, interestingly, when most of the limnologists I consulted, when I said, what will they be in 3 to 5 years, expressed a profound degree of pessimism, that they'll basically be all the same, that we're not going to solve them, and probably won't solve them very fast. So eutrophication, other pollution, aquatic invasive species, agricultural impacts moved up in the list a bit, climate change impacts on water quantity and quality, novel chemicals, sustainable freshwater supply, habitat destruction, and then inland waters' effects on marine eutrophication, and then a cast of thousands beyond that, including shortage of qualified scientists and a variety of other things. So the future, we believe, is, well, pretty similar to the present. Now, research paradigms. These are the big problems we work on in limnology. And number 1, interesting to me, since it's one I work on, is carbon biogeochemistry. Number 2, trophodynamics and food webs. Number 3, landscape limnology, terrestrial aquatic linkages, nutrient budgets, loading, nutrient limitation questions, stoichiometry. Jim Elser was thrilled when I told him. Global role of inland waters, trophic cascades, size structure, climate change effects, and microbial biodiversity and function. I'm sorry if your top favorite paradigm isn't there. There was less agreement beyond that, and it got to be basically, here's what I work on. Limnology's future top 10 paradigms, we're not too sure. Global or regional limnology, that is making inland waters relevant at greater scales, seems really important. Economic valuation also, biodiversity, ecosystem function, hydrology as a driver, nonlinearities, alternatives, stable states, effects of climate change, but there seemed to be little consensus on any of the others. A wide variety of important problems and a wide variety of important paradigms to solve those problems. The next thing I wanted to do, because the purpose of this is to look at the rapprochement between limnology and oceanography, is to see whether the problems and paradigms seen by oceanographers are similar to ours. And I'll try and go through this a little more quickly, but there are some really interesting differences. And here I've put on your left the top 10 list for limnology, and on the right the top 10 list for oceanography. Number 1 problem for oceanographers was funding, and not one limnologist mentioned that to me, which I find surprising. And I'm not, yes, okay, so it's not an environmental problem, but in a way it's an environmental problem, because if you don't have the money, you can't do the research and you can't solve the problem. Problems with funding for oceanography became their number 1 problem to solve. And we may want to take a page from that book and begin to worry about global funding for inland waters as well. The 1 centimeter of the football field that people actually use on a daily basis should be extremely well funded. Climate change, ocean acidification, public disregard for oceanographic science. Another thing maybe we'd like to pay attention to. Big data and little understanding. They are dealing with massive data collections, much as we see in sort of the GLEON program and so on. But there's a sense that we're collecting much and we're understanding little. Recruiting and supporting qualified oceanographers, global upscaling, which I should have marked in red there, as similar to limnology, point source pollution, and trophic relationships between zooplankton and exploited species. A couple noted in red are very similar to what limnologists are concerned about in terms of problems. The future problems for, future top 10 problems for oceanography, again, is they're expecting to still not have money in 10 years, and especially for the large-scale observations, but increasingly concerned about things that we know and love, hate, despise. Point source pollution, also trophic relationships between zooplankton and exploited species, again, harkening back to the history of oceanography as a food source for the planet. Biodiversity of the benthos, very similar to our concerns in limnology. Oceanic responses to climate forcing, again, very similar to ours. Big data, data synthesis, ocean exploitation, sustainability, novel means of making a living in the ocean, and genetic and molecular diversity. Molecular questions seem to come up very little on the radar screen of limnologists or oceanographers, but also in the future, oceanographers are also concerned with the climate change that preoccupies us in limnology. Oceanography's top 10 research paradigms, it just squint your eyes and you'll see that there's a whole lot more red over on the right-hand side, meaning a similarity to what we work on in limnology today. Climate change, a basic research paradigm for oceanography, global oceanography and upscaling, very similar to limnology. Tipping points, nonlinearities, regime shifts, things that we do day to day in limnology. Carbon biogeochemistry, our number one problem, according to our number one paradigm, according to the limnologists I consulted. Top-down versus bottom-up control, eutrophication, very important paradigm in oceanography, and then multiple-scale ocean structure and organismal sorts of response. A lot more similarity in paradigms than we saw in the problems that are being solved. And I'll hit that one a little harder in just a minute with a graph that will show it to you, I think, more clearly. Future paradigms are likely to be the same. Note that eutrophication, the driving force behind limnology, is foreseen by oceanographers to be the number 2 paradigm to work on in 10 years. So I think we can offer some assistance in that regard, as we have lived through it and are still living through it. Ocean sustainability, marine biodiversity, and organismal and genetic variation also to be important as they are in limnology. But they're also concerned about fisheries and food production, effects of geoengineering, multiple stressors, big data, data synthesis again, and biological and physical coupling, something that I think in limnology we've addressed. So then I wanted to know whether, so this is what people think, but my supervisor for my PhD shocked me one time and said, "John, I don't care what you think, I want to know what you know." That was the last time I was shocked by it, since obviously that's what we're supposed to do as scientists. So I thought I would look for those top 10 terms in the web of science and use those words, see the use of those words and terms and combinations of those terms in publications since 1990. So the subject areas for inland waters included limnology, inland waters, and freshwaters, and I also used oceanography and marine science. And then I reasoned that if the problems or paradigms are important to us, we will mention them in our publications, and increasingly if they're increasingly important to us. On the right-hand side, what you see is the number of publications, annual publications, that I pulled out of Web of Science for inland waters in blue and marine systems in red. And what you can see from that is the reason we can't keep up with the literature at all, and it's completely hopeless for me, is that there are 4,000 new papers coming out in inland waters journals every year at least. And about 4 times that for marine systems, about 16,000 new papers every year. And this is why it's rather difficult to keep up. So what I want to show you next is the time trends in use of those terms, the top 10 terms, first in limnology. And this is what the limnology's top 10 problems look like since about 1990 in the published literature. Most of our top 10 problems, in fact, make up greater than 1% of the publications. So greater than 1% of that 4,000 annual now. And most are growing rapidly of our top 10 terms. It's a little hard to see all these, but I've organized the figure legend at the top in order of their final appearance on the right-hand side of the graph. So climate change seems to be growing fast and is very high, up to almost 12% of publications mention this. And Antonella and Catania and I were talking about this, and we both agreed that many of us, although our paper is not on climate change, hope that it will be and say something about it. Lost biodiversity, endangered species, and xenobiotics, agricultural effects, they don't line up in the same order that the experts suggest. So opinions are different from reality to some degree. A couple of the top 10, in fact, don't seem to be growing and don't occupy much of what we do, and those include overexploitation of resources and habitat destruction, are all the way down at the bottom of the graph. But most of those things that experts think are important are in fact growing in importance. Likewise for the top 10 paradigms, arranged in exactly the same way. And some of the paradigms, they also, clearly, many of them are cited in greater than 1% of the literature, up to around 10% of the freshwater literature, with terrestrial aquatic interactions, number 1, climate change, number 2, global role of inland waters, number 3 or 4, something like that. I've got these a little bit mixed around. Trophodynamics, food webs, nutrient budgets down more toward the bottom, and then a few things like microbial biodiversity, stoichiometry, carbon biogeochemistry, and trophic cascading, sitting down a small fraction with a bare increase in attention. Limnology problems and paradigms, what does it mean? Some problems are being actively analyzed and referred to in publications. We're paying attention to them. Some important problems are understudied and need our analysis. And expert-identified important paradigms are mostly being studied increasingly. But some of the complicated things have been identified but have not attracted a lot of research study. The next question I wanted to answer, because that's the thesis of this talk, is whether oceanographers are also concerned with the same problems and paradigms as limnologists. So I did the same thing with the limnological terms, but in the oceanographic literature, and then compared the frequencies. But you see the question is, do oceanographers worry about the same problems as limnologists? My goodness, yes, they do. The figure shows that limnology's top problems are appearing in the marine literature, and we share many common concerns, including climate change, lost biodiversity, and xenobiotics especially. Then I thought I could figure out who cares more about these by plotting the ratios of the percentages. And in fact, limnologists do. Anything above the line here suggests that limnology is citing it as maybe this number 2 here would be it makes up 2 times as much of the percentage of limnological publications as it does for oceanographic ones. So most of them we care 2 to 10 times more than oceanographers about the problems. But one we're doing pretty poorly on, again, is exploitation, overuse, and exploitation. Question being then the next one, do oceanographers study limnology's top 10 paradigms very much? Are they increasing? And in fact they are. Almost all of them are increasing as rapidly in oceanographic literature as they are in limnological literature. Yes, as much or more as we do, and they're doing better with some of them. And if you, again, plot the ratios of the percentages, 1-to-1 means, the number 1 means we're doing about the same fraction of our literature on those areas. And in fact, the numbers dance around from half as much to twice as much, but not much outside that range. So we're dealing with the same paradigms and in about the same frequency. Conclusions about problems and paradigms would be that limnology has identified critical problems that need attention for society's benefit. Limnology has a strong theoretical toolkit to use for advancing those fields, and we share much of this in common with oceanographers, even though they have not discovered it yet. They seem to be increasing their focus on limnological issues as time goes on, and the concepts as well, and global change seems to be converging limnology and oceanography both in problem sets and in paradigms. So twins may try to disguise themselves, but their fundamental similarities give them away. The oceans, now I will try to justify my contention that oceans are becoming big salty lakes, while limnologists may be realizing that lakes may be small fresh oceans. And I suspect it's an overstatement, and I suspect you all know that I suspect that. On the left, you'll see ways oceans are becoming like lakes, and on the right, you see ways lakes are becoming like oceans. Seas are becoming increasingly polluted by human materials. They're subject to climate effects at many different scales. They're becoming eutrophic, and oceanographers know it. Actually, that was brought, 15 years ago, I heard a talk by David Carl, where he started talking about the steady increase in soluble reactive phosphorus concentration in the North Pacific gyre. And he attributed it to atmospheric deposition from Asia. And I went out of that talk saying, yeah, oceans are like lakes. They're getting polluted too. And so ever since that time, I've been trying to build a better argument. They're becoming eutrophic. They're suffering hypoxia like eutrophic lakes are. They're altered by changes in land use more and more. They're acidifying. We've kind of forgotten about acidification, haven't we? But in fact, it's still happening in freshwaters and in fact in groundwaters. They're having increased shore erosion from sea level rise and storms. You read down that list, it looks like what a limnologist does. Now on the right-hand side, ways lakes are becoming like ocean, and most of this is gestalt. That we are beginning to realize that about half of our waters, inland waters, are saline, so we're not actually so fresh. Acceptance that physical forces are important to function. This was really prevalent in oceanography because oceanographers were really caring about navigation very early on. Also, the understanding that large climate patterns influence function in unexpected ways, sort of like oceanography's physical biological forcing. I'd also suggest that there are several forces leading to convergence. One is inland waters this time are on the left and oceans on the right. Fresh waters are becoming more saline through diversion and climate change, whereas in oceans, they're becoming freshened by marine waters. They're becoming freshened through ice melt and increased land runoff. On the left, inland waters are increasing our inventory of our neglected biodiversity, while marine systems biodiversity is declining due to human impacts and changes in their environments and habitat destruction. On the left-hand side, inland waters are suffering altered terrestrial hydrology that changes function. And on the right-hand side, oceans are suffering altered terrestrial hydrology and shore dynamics that are changing function. We work on really similar things, but how much are we exchanging across limnology and oceanography? A good question. And there was a wonderful paper that came out in the ASLO bulletin in the winter, actually it was just in the springtime, by Kavanaugh and a great group of very young scientists working in Paul Kemp's Eco Days program. And they called this a salty divide within ASLO and looked at how frequently freshwater scientists use the marine literature versus how much do marine scientists use the freshwater or inland water literature. And they looked at a bunch of journals, and I won't tarry with that, but they did random selections of papers out of these journals over a decent time period. They tried to work on principally journals that had fairly good to excellent citation rates, and they selected a substantial number of articles randomly and then looked at how frequently they cited literature, or they cross-cited literature from the other field. And the red parts of these bars are where freshwater scientists cite marine literature, and the blue parts of the bars are where marine scientists cite freshwater literature. And it was somewhat surprising to me. We, again, are very diverse in limnology and are open to new ideas. Here, 60% of the papers, the freshwater papers published in Limnology and Oceanography cited the marine literature, whereas only about 30% of the marine papers did. Journal of Great Lakes Research, Fundamental Applied Limnology and Freshwater Biology, all sat at the freshwater papers, all sitting around 40% citation of marine literature. Whereas marine literature, about 30% in Limnology and Oceanography, 0% in deep sea research, and somewhere less than 10% for other marine journals. So we are using marine science more than marine science is using our work. Situation seems to be getting better, though. This is over various time periods. And you'll notice that the blue and red bars are closer together toward the end of the, to the right-hand side, up in the 2000s, where there's more cross-citation by, in fact, no significant difference in the fraction of marine papers citing freshwater literature and freshwater papers citing marine literature, although we're still slightly ahead in limnology. My conclusion on marine and freshwater exchange is that limnologists are using marine research in their publications. It's less true for oceanographers. The difference may be damping as oceanographers deal with more sort of limnological kinds of problems over time. Next, I want to turn to science societies that deal with limnology and oceanography, and we have a very major role. SIL and ASLO and our other sister societies, Society for Freshwater Science and Wetlands Society, Oceanographic Society, and so on, AGU. We play a very important role in promoting collaboration and exchange. So if we're to exchange ideas, it's going to be via these science societies. And we do this by meetings, publications, and workshops. Science societies, we should remember, do a variety of really great things that, in fact, nobody else can do very well. We provide objective science publications. We create scholarly meetings, such as this one, professional networking, like that you're having out in the hall, early career support and mentoring, professional interactions, building new ideas and exchanges of ideas, science discourse, enhanced diversity in training in the science, technology, engineering, and math fields, career advancing honors and awards, such as the wonderful thing you all offered to me yesterday. Thank you. Outreach and public information, independent educational resources. No one else does this or does it as well or can do it as well as science societies. The problem with this is science societies are threatened because of commercial interests who seek profit from what we do. Most society funding, not true for SIL, but most society funding usually comes from publications and meeting revenue. And the problems that we're facing are, in blue bullets, commercialization of science publishing, predatory publications, these things that come in your inbox and sound pretty convincing, and that are costing lots of money and will never appear anywhere. Predatory meetings, we had one set up down the street for the BIWA ASLO meeting, and other societies are having the same sort of thing, commercial meetings that sort of that try to look as if they are part of what societies do. And then there are also predatory training workshops that are becoming problematic. So there's leakage. The other part of this that's really important is the publication picture is changing, so science society revenues are deeply threatened. This is a graph that I put in the Limnology and Oceanography Bulletin, I think last winter, or maybe this spring. I kind of lose track of time. But basically what you want to see over here is, well, first off, 67% of the journals are corporate, 78% of the articles published are corporate, and that means that per journal they're publishing more. And of that 78% of the articles, they get slightly better in citations. So corporate publishers are now publishing more journals, more articles in those journals, and citing higher impact work, getting higher citation impact. So it's a bit of a problem, whereas societal publications, which are independent, are down to about 14% of, this is in the aquatic sciences alone, and data taken from science, from Web of Science, essentially. The other part of this that I find disturbing, we're shrinking, but we are shrinking to very small numbers of corporate publishers, and corporate control of science communication has increased to a profound degree. If you look at the right-hand side, 3 publishers now control something like 64% of all science citations in the aquatic sciences, and that's a growing number as they accumulate more and more science societies. Again, the impact of the article seems to be fairly high compared even to science society publications overall. So there's a threat. ASLO and SIL are really close neighbors, and if we're going to solve these problems, we can work together very well on. This is a principal components analysis, which a lot of you will say is inappropriate for the kind of data I had, but I looked at the the mission statements of a huge variety of science societies, and then did a PCA on them, and then we also redid the same thing by non-metric dimensional scaling, and it came out with the same result essentially. But the science societies and the aquatic sciences arrange themselves along these 2 axes: smaller land-based to large systems, and salty organismal science societies to fresh ecological societies. Okay, those are sort of our 2 axes. These are approximations of the loadings of the principal axes. ASLO sits up here, circled, and these blue ones are organizations that we have close relationships with, either in our meetings or through the Consortium of Aquatic Science Societies. And right sort of within that same data cloud is SIL and SCL. We share missions, we share our mission very closely. We're in the same science neighborhood, and I think we should start looking at collaborations within that neighborhood sphere. Close science societies can help each other in lots of ways, and we can create publishing alliances. I noticed that I flew over here on an air carrier that was in an alliance with about everybody in the world. So if large corporate organizations can form alliances, we who are used to collaboration can probably do a good job of it. We could meet more frequently and with more partners. We could share society policy and meeting expertise and costs. We can cooperate on building the recognition for our field, cooperate on increasing worldwide funding for limnology. We can help train global water expertise into the future, create cooperative publication products. And it shouldn't be just limited to journals. There are ways we can work together on this as well. Collaborate across more of our society neighborhood with other partners who share common missions and goals, and act together on the unity of the aquatic sciences, especially outside of our comfort zone, which is where we learn the most, and celebrate and enhance science interfaces. So I will conclude. Histories, and I hope I've convinced you of some of this, histories of limnology and oceanography have been intertwined for centuries. Limnology has inspired oceanography in many ways. Our greats have been their inspirations. Limnology's principal problems differ from oceanography's, but they're converging over time. Limnology's principal paradigms are frequent paradigms for oceanography and growing. Oceanography can be an ally, especially as global change alters conditions. And cooperation, not competition, is a tradition of science. And I just feel like a lot can be gained by interactions among diverse science societies and diverse scientists with very different ideas. And I hope that this will be what the future holds for us. Thanks. Can I receive a question or a tomato? Or thank you very much. Yeah. Am I done?
Thank you very much, John. Now we have 5 minutes before coffee, so if anyone has a burning question, let me say that if I'd known you were going to show a picture of Chelsea Football Club, I would never have invited you up here.
It was only the field. I just wanted the field. I looked desperately for a better one.
Okay, are there any questions or comments? There's one there. Is there a microphone? Just shout out.
Very little genetics on our radar. So I had to think of Dobzhansky, who said nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. So at least for the biological part of LNO, that seems worrying that there's no evolution at all on our radar. Yeah. And we are greatly changing selection pressures of our aquatic systems. And apparently we're not very interested to see how the organisms we study are adapting, how they are evolving in response to this. So what is your take on that?
Yes, yeah, great. I mean, it's amazing. In fact, even in the long list, it doesn't show up. There's some genetic diversity mentioned, and it's mostly mentioned as, you know, that molecular stuff. I feel as if we have very little idea, true idea of the diversity that we have now, much less how it will change. You know, what's in lakes? Microcystis, Daphnia, and largemouth bass. Oh, no, I mean, but there are lots more things. But I think our concentration on this overarching phylogenetics has been very small. I think we should use these lists not as necessarily as a map to follow, but as a place to, as a way to realize what we're not doing. And that is definitely something we are not doing very much of, nor are we integrating modern molecular techniques very much into what we do. I'm a limnologist. I was trained a limnologist, and I do have students working in molecular work. I have a PCR machine, a thermocycler in my laboratory. Well, it's dusty, yeah. But yeah, I think we need to do more of some of the things in order to become more modern. But I also think we need to do a very good job on solving the huge numbers of flagrant problems that are facing us right now. It's a service that we owe to the public.
Falling over. Okay, I think it's just about coffee time now. I'd like to just thank sincerely our Killam Memorial Lecturer, Kathy Pringle, and our plenary speakers. Thanks for a great session.